This is Good Morning Mumbai with Hrishi K.
My guest of the day is Chinmay Tumbe. He's an alumnus of the London School of Economics and Political Science and the Indian Institute of Management in Bengaluru, Ruia College, Mumbai, and also went to Rishi Valley School in Madanapalli. Currently a faculty member at the IIM Ahmedabad, a man who's very passionate about migration, cities and history. Hi, how are you doing?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me over.
Well, I have to say that I really enjoyed your book. India Moving, A History of Migration is now out on all on-ground as well as online stores. Please go and pick it up because it gives you a wonderful comprehensive history of the migration of Indian people, out-migration as well as in-migration, pre-partition and even post. And really, if you look at world history, everybody just obsesses about the migration of people out of Europe into the Americas as well as Australia and New Zealand. The Indian migration wave is as important, if not more.
Absolutely, and the whole point of the book is to convey this massive, what I argue, the Great Indian Migration Wave, which is the world's largest and longest voluntary migration system. And it's remarkable since we're sitting in Mumbai. Whether you look at the Udupi restaurants that we go to or the mangoes that we're eating today, just so many aspects of Indian culture today has been shaped by multiple migrations of communities across centuries. And so this book puts together, gives us the reader some sense of the flavor of migration that's been happening. And the volumes are tremendous. More than 100 million people today on the move in India for work. About 15 million people outside India, and we have a lot of people working in India as well. So India is really unique because it has not only emigration, internal migration, but unlike China, it also has a lot of immigration. And so this book tries to get a sense of everything.
And you single out certain areas or tracts of the country that from time immemorial have it's almost become part of their culture. Ratnagiri district, for example, where you say that is it 10% of Bharat Ratnas come from there? How amazing is that? More than that. And we're talking a culture that it's synonymous with them, that the male member will go out and work. The Ratnagiri district, talk about that.
Absolutely. I mean, in Bombay we have Dadar and Borivali stations. These are actually also names of villages in Ratnagiri. That's how important Ratnagiri and Mumbai have like a symbiotic relationship. We know it for mangoes, but it also has this missing men phenomenon. Since 1870s, they've never had a sex ratio below 1100 females to 1000 males. So the men are outside working. It's basically about 6 to 7 generations of people now where the men are outside. They spend their lifetime outside, but they also go back. And you see this in Ratnagiri everywhere. The whole economy runs on Mumbai and even the Gulf now because a lot of people go there. It shapes everything in that culture. When young boys grow up there, they know they're going to spend their lifetime outside, but they also know that they'll go back. Young girls grow up knowing that they have to look after the house and land back home. And so it's an entire economy which is shaped that way. But it's just not Ratnagiri. If you drive past Ratnagiri from Mumbai, if you go through Goa, even taluks in Goa like Bardes and Salsette, and then you go down south to Udupi, and then of course Kerala, which is this massive remittance economy. So it's the entire west coast on one side of the Western Ghats. If you cross the Western Ghats on the other side, there's actually not much migration. And so that's the importance of history and networks because the entire west coast was linked through steamers to Bombay. And so that's how these migration networks started. And so even today, though the destinations might differ, most people from Ratnagiri even today come to Bombay, most people from Kerala go to the Gulf. But it's the same sense of a remittance economy. So if you drive down, the most common two things you're going to hear are Western Union boards, which you'll see throughout, and of course shortage of labor. Everyone will be complaining about labor. And so in Kerala, you have more than 2 million North Indians now working in Kerala, jobs which the Keralites won't do. And Ratnagiri, you have about 70,000 Nepali workers picking the mangoes that we eat.
Which in a sense just breaks the north-south divide because you always thought that migrant labor will not move south of the Vindhyas, and what started happening is a situation one would never imagine. North Indian workers in Kerala, and stand-up comedians constantly make jokes about the fact that Dubai and the Arab Emirates is perhaps more than half Malayali. And that trend does continue. They see the Middle East. And what are the kind of jobs? Has that profiling changed over the sands of time? What did they go for initially from Kerala to the Middle East? And what does that eventually become, the type of jobs?
Yeah. If you look at the grand history of Kerala, of course, the connections with the Arab world have been much more long-standing. But if you look at the oil connection, it really started from Bombay in the 1940s, and there were particular recruitment centers set up in Bombay. And the first guys who joined these centers were Keralites in Bombay, not from Kerala. And then these networks started shifting to Kerala. Today, actually, the profile has changed tremendously in the last 20 years. So earlier, about only 10% was about high collar, and today it's more than 30%. So more than 30% of the Keralites who go to the Gulf now are what you would say is high skilled labor. So that profile has changed quite significantly. However, there are actually more people today who move from UP and Bihar to the Gulf than Kerala. So there's been massive shift which has happened in the past decade. And it's interesting how this shift happened. It's because the Biharis and UPites who were working in Kerala started to get to know of this, El Dorado, which was there across the sea, and they thought, okay, maybe we can also start going there. And so it's these networks formed from Kerala which have then shifted. So just like the Keralites went to the Gulf from Bombay and eventually became a major hub, the Biharis in Kerala found this network, and they themselves are migrating now. But that's more on the labor end. So the Keralites are actually going at the higher end, and the Biharis are now occupying the lower end segments in the Gulf economy.
Arvind Subramaniam, Chief Economic Advisor, says a big book, India Moving, should be read, savored, and applauded. Completely agree. Professor Chinmay Tumbe's History of Migration is in stores, and that's what we're talking about right now. The Khatris, which is a predominant caste in the Punjab, it's wonderful that you would talk about how even pre-partition, when the Mughal Sultanate or the Muslim invaders were in India, they were the only Hindu community which were kind of protected and allowed to even celebrate their own festivals and have their own kind of food because of the kind of trade that they brought in.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a fascinating community because they have a really long history. They're probably the first community with a massive overland diaspora. The Khatri mercantile network, even in the 18th century, extended almost to Russia, Astrakhan, and so on, and to the Gangetic Belt on the other side. So this is a really massive community network we form. Almost all the Guru Nanaks in the Sikh sort of religion owe their origin to the Khatri community stock as well. In terms of mercantile, in terms of trade. And you see the implication of that in the 20th century. You can't talk of Bollywood without understanding why is Bollywood so dominated by the Punjabis. You have the Kapoors and the whole gang coming from a particular part of Punjab. Even the Mahindras, for example, Bombay is one of the iconic industrialists of Bombay, belongs to the Khatri stock, and they've been very, very prominent in business, especially in the 20th century, and precisely because of partition, just like the Sindhis, they got sort of dislocated, and they've sort of spread across India. So they're very widespread in India. So when the average Punjabi entrepreneur you're going to meet, it's quite likely that the person is going to belong to this Khatri, and they have a migration history of at least 400, 500 years.
I like how you use references of popular culture in the book. For example, you talk about how Aishwarya Rai, who is from the Mangalore region, she's a Bunt from the Udupi region, meets Abhishek Bachchan, who is predominantly from Allahabad in the north, and they meet in Mumbai. So in essence, they're both migrants in that aspect. And also how you've used a popular Hindi song, which is Piya Gaye Rangoon, to describe the wave of migrants into Burma. Burma was really the golden country, or Rangoon was the city which was supposed to be paved with gold back in the day, and I mean that in a manner of speaking. Talk to us about that lure. This was pre-World War II, around World War II.
Yeah, the mass migration to Burma started from about the 1890s and it ran up to the 1930s. So if we're talking about a 40-year migration wave, you can think of it almost symmetrical to what we're seeing today from the west coast of India to the Gulf. That was happening 100 years back from the east coast of India to Burma. So Rangoon is basically today's Dubai. Almost a lot of people from Bombay's industrial class, the diamond merchants, for example, had a base. Ketan Mehta had a base in Burma. The diamond industry sort of started actually in India in a major way when these guys got displaced from Burma. So this is a really fascinating, and this Piya Gaye Rangoon is probably the best sort of song that describes it, because this was also largely men who went there, not many women. Pretty much from the east coast. The most fascinating business community which went there were the Chettiars from the south. They had massive, and when the Great Depression hit the Burmese economy, the Chettiar moneylenders overnight literally became owners of almost 25% of the net cropped area of rice out there. As a result of which, there's a lot of resentment, and eventually Indians were actually thrown out. of Burma. I mean, way before this Rohingya sort of crisis has come about, there was the first refugee crisis of India. In fact, 5 years before partition in 1942 was when about 500,000 Indians were thrown out of Burma. Eventually, very harsh citizenship laws and so on. And so Burma is this classic story where almost more than 1.5 million Indians who were there were forcibly displaced eventually. But during its heyday, it was really this sort of magnet which got all Indians from the East Coast, from Kanyakumari, from Tamil Nadu to Bengal, working out there. The most fascinating connection comes from a district called Ganjam in Odisha. Mass migration from Odisha from Ganjam to Burma, and that mass migration continues. It's not that it stopped, but they just switched, completely all the way around. And so today they all go to Surat or Gujarat, and so there's this huge migration wave from one district, Ganjam, earlier towards Rangoon, today towards Surat. So the same source regions but different destinations.
Well, just an aside, since you were talking about the Chettiar community, we're basically Tamils. So my father used to debate against M.A. Chidambaram, P. Chidambaram, I beg your pardon, the former finance minister of India, when he was in engineering college in Tamil Nadu, and he used to talk about how P. Chidambaram was extremely wealthy even before he got into politics, because he was from the Chettiar community, and that's again a long line of Chettiars.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, way before the Marwadis and the Sindhis and the Gujaratis amassed their wealth really in the 20th century. If you ask me which was the richest community of India in the early 20th century, undoubtedly the Chettiars. Their financial empire straddled with not just India but Southeast Asia. They had more than 400 firms in Burma, and then they had firms in Vietnam, Indochina, region, what you would call as Laos, Vietnam, and so on, as well as Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand. So they really controlled a lot of the trade and credit supply in this part of the world, and it's really remarkable. It's like the Parsis. It's a community of less than 100,000 people, so it's a really tiny community. And if you go there today, Chettinad, it's still got these ancient houses built by Burmese teakwood, but it's the sort of business empire has collapsed because they lost all their wealth in the Burmese shock. In fact, there's still a Burmese investors group which is taking claim, so they want their money back even after 50 years after they've been thrown out. I don't think that's ever going to happen, though.
I'm going to come to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and some other painful aspects of partition, but before that, did you enjoy the India Culture Lab Migration Museum, the one-day migration museum? How was it, and tell us your feedback?
Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. So the Migration Museum brought together fantastic exhibits. There's one by Godrej Archives on a particular workforce of theirs who migrated, porters. They had a fantastic exhibit on that. There were screenings, there were exhibits, lovely documentaries. The best part of the day was on food recipes. And the India Culture Lab at Godrej, they actually got migrant women workers on stage to share some of their recipes, and we actually had some food. And I think that sort of gives you the element and range in which migration touches our lives, from films, from language, and especially food. In Mumbai, for example, virtually everything we eat is some sort of a fusion between different migrant cultures. So it was a fantastic event.
Well, I hope Parmesh and a team decide to make it an annual affair. Is that a plan?
Absolutely. Yeah. They should, definitely. They should, yeah.
Incidentally, he gave a master class, Professor Chinmay Tumbe. For those of you tuned in late, India Moving, A History of Migration is out on all online and on-ground stores. I'm a voracious reader. You would know that if you've been listening to me over the decades, and I highly advocate that you buy this. Let's move on to Sri Lanka. I mean, here is a tiny little island there, and legend has it that Patliputra and Ashoka's empire in Bihar, there was a mass migration back in the day, and they took Buddhism there to Sri Lanka. And at the same time, because it was only the Palk Strait, very little separating Tamil Nadu from Sri Lanka, the Tamils again migrated. So another important mass migration.
Absolutely. And if you see the first Sri Lankan census, they had the Sinhalese majority, but then the census classified two Tamils. There's something called as the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Indian Tamils. So this refers to two different waves of migration. One much older, so many centuries ago, and one which started really with the plantations, labor migration which started from the middle of the 19th century. So they have these two different kind of Tamils. So when we talk of the LTT, for example, the famous organization, that was the Sri Lankan Tamils. There's not so much of Indian Tamils who migrated in the middle of the 19th century, asserting for autonomy and so on. And interestingly, these three sort of communities have had very, very tense relationships with each other. Much of the Sri Lankan economic boom in the early 20th century was because of this Tamil labor which used to move from Tamil Nadu to Sri Lanka to work on the plantations. So very close connection. And again, just like in Burma, when the Burmese economy sort of shrank, there's a lot of pressure. In the 1960s, suddenly Sri Lanka said, okay, enough is enough, and all of you need to go back. And there's a famous treaty, and based on which not everyone came back, and that's why you still have a large Indian Tamil population there. It's a small fraction, but you had about 200,000 people returning. And then you had a different set of Tamils, the Sri Lankan Tamils, who've come in as refugees. So if you go to Tamil Nadu today, you have a lot of refugee settlements, estimated about 150,000 Tamils still living in refugee camps. And so when people talk about Syrian refugees and a variety of refugees issues around the world, we sort of struggle to realize that actually we also have a lot of refugees in India even today.
And cricket is such a universally loved sport, in particular in India. And you'd find these West Indian cricketers like Ram Naresh Sarwan and Shiv Narayan Chandapal, and not help but try and guess which part of the country they were from.
Absolutely.
Indian migrants to the Caribbean. And the West Indies in that aspect was a very important colony for the British to actually move a lot of workers there.
Yeah. Like as one historian said, the British Empire was built on a massive sugar rush, and so sugar plantations which really got people moving. Much of these plantation world of Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Indians were brought in large numbers in the 19th century, and many of the descendants. And so World Cup is a classic template of Indian migration around the world, because mostly former British colonies and Indians went there in large numbers. It's interesting, though, the very big difference between the Indians who went to Burma and Sri Lanka compared to those Indians who went to the Caribbean world. One, most of them were drawn from the Gangetic Plains, so they were mostly from the Bihari sort of origin stock, eastern UP Bihar. Second, they went initially, though it was male dominated, because the distance was so large, they rarely returned. And so a lot of these guys were basically family-based migration, and so they settled down there. And so in many of those islands, actually, you'll find that Indians comprise a large percentage of the population. Many political leaders are also of Indian sort of ethnicity. And by and large, they've sort of coexisted very peacefully with not only other migrants, but the natives, indigenous populations out there. Interestingly, caste is also sort of dissolved. I mean, a lot of people think, what happens to caste with Indians outside? But it seems like after 150 years out there, some aspects of religion stays on. Ramayana, for example, is still very popular. But interestingly, in very interesting ways, caste has either dissolved or changed fundamentally out there, because there's very, very little contact since then.
And now let's come to some, painful conflicts which have resulted in the mass migration of people. The war for East Pakistan, which is the war of Bangladesh, saw lots of refugees coming into Bengal, and that's something that you've devoted a lot of time on as far as your book is concerned. So run our listeners through that, please.
So this is till date the world's largest refugee crisis, much bigger than the Syrian refugee crisis, that's going on right now. Almost 10 million refugees flowed into India in 1971, just in that particular year. Most went back, so that's also a case. But they came within 8 months, 10 million people within a month. So in many districts, you had the refugee population more than the initial district population, especially on the Eastern Front. And so as a result of this, this was a potential mass catastrophe in terms of epidemics, in terms of disease, and so on. And what's little known is that actually India did a really good job in managing the situation. This is probably the best case of refugee management ever. Of course, it's unique because the war ended and refugees could easily go back, which is not quite the case with, for example, the Syrian refugee crisis. The war is still on. But we know that when wars happen, most refugees eventually want to go back. And so the best thing to do is to enable peaceful conditions back there. What's probably less known is that the people who won the war, some of the key people, they themselves were descendants of refugees. For example, the two army generals, Sam Manekshaw, one of the most decorated army officers of India, and F.R. Jacob. So Sam Manekshaw is a Parsi, and F.R. Jacob was a Baghdadi Jew. And both these communities are part of India's sort of fabric, and both of them are descendants of persecuted refugees, the Parsis as well as Baghdadi Jews. So it's ironic because this massive war, which was sort of started because of a refugee crisis, was also sort of solved eventually. Two of the principal architects of that were themselves descendants of refugees.
I find it fascinating that an entire community, which is the Sindhis, moves into India without even a state. and they settle into camps like Sindhi camp in Mumbai and Ulhasnagar. And today there's such a bustling, vibrant business community. It's almost as though they made sure that the generations to come were taught that the roof above your head is the most important thing in this world.
Absolutely. So Sindhis, I think what's less known is that they were displaced twice. The creation of the Sindhi identity itself started with a displacement about 200 years back. And then again after partition. In between, of course, a lot of them migrated. I think the most famous group in Bombay, House of Motwani of Chicago Radio, for example, they migrated before partition. So they've already links before partition.
Vikramaditya Motwani, the director, belongs to that particular family.
Yes.
He's directed some award-winning films. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. So the Sindhi community started migrating well before partition. They started establishing links, but partition was a major shock. Nobody really saw it coming. In fact, what's interesting about partition is that though people knew that the lines would eventually be drawn as the deadline came, nobody really thought the migrations would happen. It's remarkable when you see, what eventually happened. People thought that people would still stay on, but because of the violence which was unleashed, people had to move, and the Sindhis moved. Sindhis moved all over the world. Sindhi is probably the most transnational Indian community that we know of today, ranging from, there's a book from, Sindhis from Bukhara to Panama. So they had a very wide network before partition, and after partition they've consolidated. Some of the richest entrepreneurs today in business people in Africa, for example, today trace their origin to the Sindhi community. What's interesting is they still marry among each other. So, they have a wide network, and the marriage market, like in India, is across cities. They are across cities around the world. So you can have a Hong Kong Sindhi family marrying into, some family in Lagos in Africa.
Well, I have to come to my community, which is the Tambram community. And there was a whole decade, which in particular was the 80s and the 90s, a couple of decades, where lesser known fact that the Mandal Commission was first implemented in Tamil Nadu, even before Delhi University was protesting against it and things like that. And there were very few seats for Brahmins in engineering colleges as well as medical colleges, which is why, there's a whole slew of them just migrating to the US. And obviously that the classic brain drain, which you talk about, also happened, during that time. You don't find people that crazy about migrating to the US anymore, but that was a huge wave from the Tamil Nadu, a particular community moving abroad.
Yeah, I think the Tambram community is very fascinating, especially, the success it's achieved if you see all these, top guys. And the foreword of the book is itself written by one. So what's interesting is, of course, that I would argue that this migration started much earlier. So reservations, of course, is one of the reasons it sort of aggravated. But this is really a migration starting from the early 20th century. And first the civil service positions in the Madras presidency, but then civil services across India as well. And that's why even today you'll find a variety of civil services, especially in the defense sector, which have these very strong networks which have been formed by the Tambram community. And of course, two of the most famous economists, Raghuram Rajan and Arvind Subramaniam themselves belong to this community. I would say the brain drain aspect is also a bit slightly sort of different in the sense it started in the 70s, a lot of opportunities in the US, and I think it's precisely because the opportunities have opened up in India in the last 20-30 years that people have this whole idea of brain drain has sort of reduced. But Bombay has a large community of Tambrams, and everyone's grateful because of the food.
Well, I could go on and on and on. I've loved your book so much, but unfortunately we're running out of time. We have closed the show. Just a bit of a personal insight from you. Do you teach business history at IMA?
I teach a course on urban economics and a course on business and economic history. The course has a very interesting name. It's called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Business and Economies Across 5 Centuries.
I can really imagine, or try and imagine what that must mean. Your students must be very, very happy. So is there going to be a follow-up, or are you going to do a book on an entirely different subject?
It's a different subject, but it's related but different.
Excellent. We shall welcome you back in studio at that time. If people were to reach out to you, are you active on social networking?
Yeah.
Is there an email ID?
Sure, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and all social media. Yeah.
Is it just Chinmay Tumbe?
Yeah, just Chinmay Tumbe. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much
Thank
for
you so
rolling
much for
by.
having
Cheers.
me.